Welcome, everybody. Today we will be reading chapter 21. It's going to be a long one. This chapter and the next chapter are both really, really long, so strap in. I'm going to be moving around a lot in this one just to stay comfortable. In fact, let me go ahead and do that just to go ahead and start. Alright, let's see. Chapter 21. Ember's Tomb. The hill was smooth and green. Set into its base was a simple post and lintel doorway. Two enormous rough stone slabs standing upright, with a third slab laid across them. In the space between them was darkness. It reminded Quentin of a subway entrance. It was just dawn, and the door was on the western face of the hill, so the hill's shadow fell over them. The grass was frosted with pale dew. There was no sound at all. The shape of the hill was a pure, emerald green sine wave against the lightning sky. Whatever was going to happen here. They stopped and huddled 100 yards away, miserable and unshowered, to pull themselves together. The morning was chilly. Quentin rubbed his hands together and tried a warmth spell that only left him feeling feverish and slightly queasy. He couldn't seem to get oriented to Fillory circumstances. He had slept heavily the night before, with vivid dreams, the weight of his fatigue sinking him down into dark, primal realms, haunted by roaring winds and tiny furry beasts, early mammals hiding fearfully in the long grass. He wished he could just stand here a little longer and look at the pink light on the dew. Everybody had a heavy hunting knife, which back on Earth had seemed beyond overkill, but now felt pathetically inadequate. The shape of the hill tugged at something in his deep memory. He thought of the hill they'd seen in the enchanted mirror, in that musty little storeroom back at Breakbills, where he and Alice and Penny had studied together so long ago. It looked like the same hill. But so did 1,000 hills. It was just a hill. So just to be clear, Elliot was saying to Dent and Finn, it's called Ember's Tomb, but Ember isn't buried here, and he's not dead. He sounded exactly as relaxed and unworried as he ever had back at Breakbills, just dotting the I's, clearing up all the details, the way he would have insouciantly picked apart one of Bigby's problem sets, or decoded a closely written wine label. He was in control. The deeper they rolled into Fillory, the shakier Quentin felt. But Elliot was the opposite. He just got calmer and more sure of himself, exactly the way Quentin had thought that Quentin would, and exactly the way that he wasn't. Every age finds a use for this place, Finn was saying. A mine, a fortress, a treasure house, a prison, a tomb. Some dug it deeper. Others walled up the parts they didn't need or wish to forget. It is one of the deep ruins. So you've been here before? Anais asked. I mean, in there. Finn shook her head. Not this one. 100 places like it. Except that the crown is in this one, and how did it get there exactly? Quentin had wondered the same thing. If the crown really had belonged to Martin, maybe that was where he went when he disappeared. Maybe he died down there. The crown is there, Dent snapped. We will go in and get it. Enough questions. He swirled his cape impatiently. Alice was standing very near Quentin. She looked small and still and cold. Quentin, I don't want to go in there, she said softly, without looking at him. Over the past week, Quentin had devoted literally hours to fantasizing about what he would say to Alice if she ever spoke to him again. But all his carefully planned speeches fell away at the sound of her voice. She wasn't going to get a speech. It was so much easier to be angry. Being angry made him feel strong, even though, and this contradiction did nothing to diminish his anger, he was angry only because his position was so weak. "So go home," was all he said. That wasn't right either, but it was too late, because somebody was running toward them. The weird thing was that the entrance to the tomb was still 100 yards off, and Quentin could see the creatures coming the whole way. 2 of them, running flat out across the wet grass for at least a minute, like they were out doing early morning wind sprints. It was almost funny. They weren't human, and they didn't seem to belong to the same species as each other either, but they were both cute. One was something like a giant hare, squat and covered in gray-brown fur, maybe 4 feet tall and about that wide. It hopped toward them determinedly, its long ears flattened back. The other one was more like a ferret, or maybe a meerkat? A weasel? Quentin tried to think what the closest equivalent furry animal would be. Whatever it was, it ran upright and it was tall, 7 feet at least. Most of it long, silky torso. Its face was chinless, with prominent front teeth. This odd couple came charging at them across the green grass silently. No battle cry, no soundtrack, in the still early morning air. At first it looked like they might be running to greet them, but Bunny had short, stubby swords in both its front paws, held out steady in front of him as he ran, and Ferret was hefting a quarterstaff. They closed to within 50 yards. The Breakbills crowd shrank back involuntarily, as if the newcomers exerted an invisible force field. This was it. They had come to the end of what was conceivable. Something was about to give. It had to. Dent and Finn didn't move. Quentin realized there wasn't going to be any parlay or rock, paper, scissors. This was going to be about stabbing. He had thought he was ready, but he wasn't. Somebody had to stop it. The girls were hanging on to each other as if in a howling wind, even Alice and Janet. "Oh my God," Quentin thought. "This is really happening. This is really happening." Ferret arrived first. It stutter-stepped to a jittery stop, breathing hard. Its huge eyes blinked as it smoothly spun its staff two-handed, in a figure-8 pattern. It whickered in the still air. "Yup," yelled Finn. "Ha!" Dent answered. They set themselves side by side as if they were getting ready to lift something heavy. Then Dent stepped back, ceding first blood. "Jesus," Quentin heard himself say. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." He wasn't ready for this. This wasn't magic. This was the opposite of magic. The world was ripping open. Ferret fainted once, and snapped a nasty jab at Finn's face. The 2 ends of the quarterstaff were now glowing an ominous, enchanted orange, like the tip of a cigarette. Somebody shrieked in the silence. Even as one end of the staff whipped forward, Finn turned away from it, bowling forward at the waist, ducking the jab, and turning seamlessly, almost lazily, into a graceful spinning roundhouse kick. She seemed to be moving slowly, but her foot clocked Ferret's weak chin hard enough to spin his head around a quarter turn. Ferret grinned, with blood in its big teeth, but it had more bad news coming. Finn was still spinning, and her next kick connected low and hard with the side of its knee. The knee bent in, sideways, wrongly. Ferret staggered and aimed the same jab at Finn's face, whereupon Finn caught the flashing quarterstaff barehanded. The smack of it hitting her open palm was like a rifle shot. She dropped her slick martial arts elegance and tussled savagely, messily, for control. For a second they froze, vibrating with isometric strain, while Ferret, with agonizing comical slowness, stretched its neck forward to try to bite Finn's bare throat with its big rodent incisors. But she had it outmuscled. Finn slowly forced the staff up under its chin, right into where its Adam's apple would be, while her right foot stamped pneumatically on the outside of its hurt knee, over and over again. It gagged and twisted away. Just as Quentin thought he couldn't watch anymore, Ferret made its last mistake. It took its paw off the quarterstaff for an instant. It looked like it was going for a knife strapped to its thigh. With the extra leverage, Finn flung it down hard on the turf, and the wind huffed out of it. "Huh!" she barked, and stamped twice on its thickly furred throat, hard. A long, gargling rattle followed. The first sound Quentin had heard it make. Finn popped up, visibly amped, her face red under the blood buzz cut. She picked up the quarterstaff, braced herself, and broke it over her knee in one try. Throwing the broken pieces aside, she leaned down and screamed in Ferret's face. "Ah!" The broken ends of the staff spat out a few feeble burnt orange sparks on the grass. 60 seconds had passed, maybe not even that. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," Quentin said, hugging himself. Someone was throwing up on the grass. It had never once even occurred to him to try to help. He wasn't ready for this. This wasn't what he'd come here for. Meanwhile, the other assassin, the squat, muscular bunny, had never arrived on the scene. Dent had done something to the ground beneath its long rabbit feet, or maybe to its sense of balance so that it couldn't seem to stand up. It was scrabbling around helplessly on the grass like it was wet ice. Finn, on a roll, stepped over Ferret's body toward him, but Dent stopped her. He turned back to the Breakbills crowd. "Can any of you take him from here? Bow and arrow, maybe?" Quentin couldn't tell if he was pissed that they weren't helping, or if he was just being polite, offering them a taste of the action. "Anybody!" Nobody answered. They stared at him like he was speaking gibberish. Every time the muscle-bound hare tried to get up, its paws kept flying out from under it. Chittering and weeping, the hare shouted a guttural cry and threw one of its swords at them, but it slipped again and the sword landed safely short and off to one side. Dent waited for an answer from the group, then turned away disgustedly. He made a quiet tapping gesture with his wand, like he was ashing a cigar, and a bone in the hare's upper thigh snapped audibly. It screamed in falsetto. "Wait!" It was Anais, pushing her way forward past a waxwork Janet. "Wait, let me try." The fact that Anais could even walk and talk right now was incomprehensible to Quentin. She began a spell, but stuttered a few times, rattled, and had to start over. Dent waited, obviously impatient. On her third try, she completed a sleep spell that Penny had taught them. Bunny's grunting struggles ceased. It sagged onto its side on the grass, looking alarmingly sweet. Ferret was still gagging weakly, eyes open and staring at the sky, red foam pouring from its mouth, but nobody paid any attention to it. No part of it below its neck was moving. Anais went over and picked up the short sword the hare had thrown. "There," she said to Dent proudly. "Now we kill it. No problem." She hefted the sword, happily, in one hand. As a teenager in Brooklyn, Quentin had often imagined himself engaging in martial heroics, but after this, he knew, as a cold and immutable fact, that he would do anything necessary, sacrificing whatever or whomever he had to avoid risking exposure to physical violence. He wasn't even ashamed. Shame never came into it. He embraced his new identity as a coward. He would run in the other direction. He would lie down and cry and put his arms over his head or play dead. It didn't matter what he had to do. He would do it and be glad. They trailed after Dent and Finn, and what kind of retarded names were those anyway? Dent and Finn? He thought numbly. Through the doorway and into the hill. through the doorway and into the hill. He barely noticed his surroundings. A square stone corridor opened out into a huge open chamber that looked almost as big as the hill that contained it, which must have been mostly hollow. Green tinted light filtered down through a circular oculus at the room's apex. The air was full of stone dust. The ruins of an enormous brass orrery stood in the center of the room, its skinny arms stripped of its planets. It looked like a broken, defoliated Christmas tree, the smashed spheres lying at its base like fallen ornaments. Nobody noticed a large, 10 feet long, large, green lizard standing frozen amid the remains of shattered tables and benches until it abruptly unfroze and skittered off into the shadows, claws scritching on the stone floor. The horror was almost pleasant. It wiped away Alice and Janet and everything else except itself, like a harsh, abrasive cleanser. They wandered from room to empty room, down echoing stone hallways. The floor plan was beyond chaotic. The stone work changed styles and patterns every 20 minutes as a new generation of masons took over. They took turns putting light spells on their knives, their hands, various inappropriate body parts in an effort to break the tension. Having tasted blood, Anais now tagged after Dent and Finn like an eager puppy, lapping up whatever observations she could get out of them about personal combat. They never had a chance, Finn said with professional disinterest. Even if Dent hadn't taken the second one, even if I had been alone, the quarterstaff is not a collaborative weapon. It simply takes up too much room. Once the tall one is into a form, those tips are flying left and right, up and down. He can't afford to worry about his friend. You face them one-on-one, and you move on. They should have fallen back, waited for us together in that big chamber, taken us by surprise. Anais nodded, obviously fascinated. Why didn't they? She asked. Why did they come running straight at us? I don't know, Finn frowned. Could have been an honor thing. Could have been a bluff. They thought we'd run. Could be. They were under a spell. They couldn't help it. Did we have to kill them? Quentin burst out. Couldn't we have just... I don't know. What? Anais turned it on him, sneering. Maybe we could have taken them prisoner. We could have rehabilitated them. I don't know, he said helplessly. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. Tied them up? Look, I guess I just wasn't that clear on what it would actually be like. Killing people. It made him think of the day the beast appeared. That same bottomless feeling, all bets off, like the cable had snapped and they were all in free fall. Those are not people, Anais said. Those were not people. And they tried to kill us first. We were breaking into their home. Glory has its price, Penny said. Did you not know that before you sought it? Well, I guess they paid the price for us, huh? To Quentin's surprise, Elliot rounded on him too. What, you're going to back out? You? Elliot laughed a bitter, barking laugh. You need this almost as badly as I do. I'm not backing out, I'm just saying. Quentin had time to wonder why exactly Elliot did need this before Anais cut them off. Oh, God, please. Can we not? She shook her curly head in disgust. Can we all just not? For hours and 3 flights of stairs and 1 mile of empty corridor later, Quentin was examining a door when it opened suddenly, hard, smacking him in the face. He took a step backward and put a hand to his upper lip. In his half-stunned state, he was more preoccupied with whether or not his nose was bleeding than with who or what had just slammed the door into it. He raised the back of his back of his hand to his upper lip, checked it, raised it again, then checked it again. Yep, definitely bleeding. An elfin being struck its narrow, angry face around the edge of the door and glared at him. Purely by reflex, Quentin kicked it shut. He'd been about to point out the door to the others, who were busy surveying a wide, low-ceilinged room with a dry basin in the center. A creeping ivy-like plant had grown out of the basin and halfway up the walls and then died. Daylight was a months ago memory. There were twinkly lights going off behind Quentin's eyes, and his nose felt like a warm, melting gob of something salty and throbbing. With melodramatic slowness, the door creaked open again, gradually revealing a slightly pointy-featured man wearing black leather armor. He didn't look particularly surprised to see Quentin. The man, elf, whatever, whipped a rapier out of his belt and snapped into a formal fencing stance. Quentin backed away, gritting his teeth with fear and resignation. Just like that, Fillory had vomited out another one of its malignant menagerie. Maybe fatigue had dulled the edge of his fear, but almost unbeknownst to himself, Quentin was enunciating the words to Penny's magic missile spell. He'd practiced it back in New York, and now he backpedaled as he cast it because the Black Elf, as Quentin tagged him, was advancing on him using a Ponzi sideways fencing shuffle. His free hand held aloft, wrist limp. And Quentin was getting the spell right. He could feel it, and he was loving himself for getting it right. Terror and physical pain sharpened and simplified Quentin's moral universe. He snapped the magical dart straight into the elf's chest. The black elf coughed and sat down hard, looking dismayed. His face was the perfect height for kung fu kicking, so Quentin, in what felt like an act of consummate bravery, kicked him savagely in the face. The rapier clattered to one side. "Ha!" Quentin shouted. It was like when he'd fought Penny, when the fear had left him. Was this battle rage at last? Was he going to become a berserker like Finn? It felt so good to stop being afraid. Nobody else in the room had noticed what was going on, not until he yelled. Now the scene tilted and slid into nightmare. 4 more black elves scrambled through the open door, carrying an assortment of weapons, followed by 2 goat-legged men and 2 terrifying, flying giant bumblebees the size of basketballs. Also present was something fleshy and headless that scrambled along on 4 legs and in a silent, wispy figure composed of white mist. With the 2 teams arranged on their respective sides of the room, a staring match ensued. It all reminded Quentin powerfully of the opening moments of a game of dodgeball. His body seethed. He wanted to cast the missile spell again. He'd gone from feeling frail and vulnerable and cowardly to feeling badass and supercharged and armor-plated. The 2 mercenaries were whispering and pointing, choosing up targets. Finn picked up a pebble and tossed it lightly, sidearm, at one of the fawns. They had evil fawns now, who let it bounce off a round leather buckler strapped to its forearm. He looked pissed. "The Grimling's the problem," Quentin heard Finn say to Dent. "Yeah, leave the Pangborn, though. I have something for that." Dent withdrew a wand from his cape and appeared to write something in the air with it. He said a couple of words into the tip, like it was a microphone. Then he indicated one of the fawns with it. A conductor, cueing a soloist. The fawn burst into flame. It was like it was made of magnesium soaked in gasoline and had just been waiting for an errant spark to set it off. No part of it was not on fire. It took a step backward, then turned to the goat man next to it as if to say something. Then it fell down, and Quentin couldn't look at it anymore. As all hell broke loose, he tried to hang on to the gleeful bloodlust he'd felt so clearly a moment ago, to fan it back to life, but he'd lost it, fumbled it in the confusion. Finn was thriving. This was evidently what she trained for. Quentin had missed it before, but she was actually mixing in a little magic as she fought. Her Ink Aga was a hybrid technique, a martial art fully integrated with some highly specialized spellcasting style. Her lips moved, and there were white flashes where her fist and hand strikes landed. Meanwhile, Dent addressed himself to the ghostly, misty figure, saying something inaudible that caused it to struggle and then be dispersed by an invisible, soundless, roaring gale. Quentin took a quick inventory of his brave company. Elliot had made himself useful by casting a kinetic spell on the second satyr, pinning it safely to the ceiling. Anais had her short sword out. It had a moonlight glimmer to it now, which meant she'd put a sharpness charm on it, and was looking eagerly around for somebody to stick it into. Janet was hugging herself against the back wall, her face wet and shining with tears. Her eyes were blank. She was gone. Too many things were happening at once. Quentin's stomach clenched when he realized an elf had singled Alice out and was advancing across the dry basin toward her, twirling a long, straight knife. Were they called poniards? In each hand. It was obvious from Alice's face that every spell she'd ever learned had just now slipped her mind. She turned away, dropped to one knee, and locked her hands behind her head. Nobody in the history of all the conflicts in the world had ever looked more defenseless. He only had time to feel all the tenderness he had ever felt for her surge up in one indefinitely concentrated instant, and to be surprised that it was all still there, moist and intact beneath the unsightly scorched layer of his anger. Before the back of Alice's blouse tore wide open, and a small leathery biped clawed its way vigorously out of the skin of her back. It was a party trick, a showgirl bursting out of a cake. Alice had loosed her cacodemon. No question, the cacodemon was instantly the happiest being in the room. This was exactly the party it wanted to be at. Facing the elf, it bounced on its toes like a wiry little tennis pro, prepping for return of service. With triple match point on its side, its leap was evidently several beats faster than its opponent had counted on. In a moment, it was past the poniards and had fastened its wiry grip on the elf's upper arms and buried its horrible face in the soft hollow of the elf's throat. The elf gagged and sawed futilely at the demon's shark-skinned back with its knives. Quentin reminded himself for at least the 100th time never to underestimate Alice again. And just like that, it was over. They were out of opponents. The elves and the bees were down. The room was full of acid smoke from the burned satyr. Finn owned most of the body count. She was already running through a post-combat warm-down ritual, stepping backward through the forms she'd executed in the brief battle and whispering their names to herself. Penny was carefully casting a sleep spell on the satyr that Elliot had stuck to the ceiling, while Anais watched, impatient to admire the coup de grace. Quentin noted, with the pettiest possible annoyance, that they had the satyr without the buckler, which meant that Dent had burned the satyr with the buckler, which meant that he couldn't loot the buckler for himself. He had a crusty, dried mustache from his bloody nose. That wasn't so bad, he told himself. That wasn't such a nightmare. He risked a shuddering sigh of relief. Was that really it? Had they gotten everything? Janet had finally thawed from her frozen state and was busy with something. Unlike everything else they'd seen, the fleshy, headless, four-legged creature was neither humanoid, nor obviously related to any terrestrial fauna. It was radially symmetrical, like a starfish, with no obvious front or back or face. It stood unreadable in a dark corner, taking sudden scary little hops in unexpected directions. It had a large faceted gem embedded in its back. Decoration? Or was that its eye? Its brain? Hey! Finn snapped her fingers in Janet's direction. Hey! Evidently, she'd forgotten Janet's name. Leave that. Leave the gremlin to us. Janet ignored her. She continued to take wary steps towards it. Quentin wished she wouldn't. She was in no kind of emotional state to be working magic. Janet! He shouted. Shit. Dent said distinctly. It was a businesslike shit. Another damn mess for him to clean up. He brought his wand back out from wherever he'd stashed it. But before he could act, Janet reached carefully behind her back and brought out something small but heavy. Gripping it with both hands, she made a small adjustment and then fired 5 shots into the creature at close range. The pistol bounced upward with each shot, and each time she carefully re-aimed it. The sound was shattering in the low-ceilinged chamber. One shot struck sparks off the jewel in the gremlin's back. It sank to the floor, shivering and deflating like a parade balloon, still expressionless. It made a high, urgent whistling sound. By the 5th shot, it was visibly dead. Nothing and nobody in the room moved. Janet turned around. The tears she had shed earlier were already dry. She glared at them. "What the fuck are you looking at?" she said. It got colder and deeper. It got colder the deeper they went. At 6 stories underground, Quentin was shivering in his heavy sweater and thinking nostalgically about the warm, puffy parkas they'd abandoned way back by the sunny little stream. They broke it for a rest in a circular room with a beautiful lapis lazuli spiral inlet in the floor. Dark green ambient light emanated from somewhere, like the light in an aquarium. Dent sat in the lotus position, wrapped his cape around him, and meditated. A gap of about 6 inches separated him from the floor. Finn did calisthenics. The break was clearly not for their benefit. They were like professional mountaineers impatiently shepherding a herd of rich, fat cats up the slopes of Mount Everest. The Breakbills party was a package they were contractually obligated to deliver. Alice sat by herself on a stone bench, her back against a pillar, looking blankly at a mosaic on the wall depicting a sea monster. A creature like an octopus, but much larger and with many more than 8 legs. Quentin straddled the bench at the other end, facing her. Her eyes flicked over to his for a long moment. There was not a hint of either contrition or forgiveness in them. He made sure his eyes looked the same. They watched the mosaic. The little squares that made up the sea creature were moving very slowly, rearranging themselves on the wall. The crude blue waves rolled along very gradually. It was easy, decorative magic. There was a bathroom floor at Breakbills that had much the same effect. Alice felt like a black hole that was trying to pull him in, rip the flesh clean off him with its sheer toxic gravity. Finally, she took out her canteen and used it to wet a spare white sock. "Let's do something about your nose," she said. She reached out to dab at his face, but at the last minute he realized he didn't want her to touch him. He took the sock himself, carefully. It turned pink as he wiped at his upper lip. "So what was it like," Quentin said, "when you let the demon out?" Now that the high of combat was gone and she was no longer in danger, his anger came creeping back. The anesthetic was wearing off. It was an effort not to say anything vicious. She hiked her foot up onto the bench and started undoing the laces on her sneakers. "Felt good," she said carefully. "I thought it would hurt, but it was kind of a relief, like sneezing. I never felt like I could really breathe with that thing inside me." Interesting. Did it feel as good as fucking Penny? He'd actually thought he was going to be civil, but it was too hard. The words came out of his mouth. The words came out of his mouth of their own malevolent volition. He wondered what else he would say. I've got all kinds of demons inside of me, he thought, not just the one. If he'd managed to hurt Alice, she didn't let it show. She carefully peeled off a sock. A nasty white blister covered the entire ball of her foot. They watched the mosaic some more. A little boat had floated into the scene, a lifeboat maybe, or a launch from a whaler. It was crowded with tiny people. It looked pretty much like a done deal that the sea creature was going to crush the little boat in its many long green arms. That was... She stopped and started over. That wasn't good. So why did you do it? Alice tilted her head thoughtfully, but her face was white. To get back at you. Because I was feeling like shit about myself. Because I didn't think you would care. Because I was drunk, and he came on pretty strong. So he raped you. No, Quentin, he did not. Never mind. Stop talking. I don't think I understood how much it would hurt you. Just stop talking. I can't talk to you anymore. I can't hear anything you're saying. He'd started that little speech speaking normally, and he ended it shouting. In a way, fighting like this was just like using magic. You said the words, and they altered the universe. By merely speaking, you could create damage and pain, cause tears to fall, drive people away, make yourself feel better, make your life worse. Quentin leaned forward, all the way forward, until he had placed his forehead on the cool marble of the bench in front of him. His eyes were closed. He wondered what time it was. His head felt a little spinny. He could fall asleep right there, he thought. Just like this. He wanted to tell Alice he didn't love her, but he couldn't. Because it wasn't true. It was the one lie he couldn't quite tell. I wish this were over, Alice quietly said quietly. What? This mission, this adventure, whatever you want to call it. I want to go home. I don't. This is bad, Quentin. Somebody's going to get hurt. Good. I hope they do. If I die doing this, at least I'll have done something. Maybe you'll do something one of these days instead of being such a pathetic little mouse all the time. She said something he didn't catch. What? I said, don't talk to me about death. You don't know anything about it. For no reason, and against his express conscious wishes, some very tight elastic band of muscle around Quentin's chest relaxed very slightly. Something between a laugh and a cough escaped him. He sank back against his pillar. God, I am literally losing my fucking mind. Across the room, Anais sat with Dent, talking intently and going over a handmade map of their progress so far that he'd sketched out what looked suspiciously like graph paper. Anais seemed more like a part of the guide's gang than the Breakbills gang now. As he watched, she bent over the map, deliberately smushing her tit into Dent's shoulder as she did so. Josh was nowhere to be seen. Penny and Elliot were dozing on the floor in the center of the room, their heads resting on their packs. Elliot had hectored Janet about the room. Their heads rested... Elliot had hectored Janet about the gun until he extracted a promise from her to dispose of it responsibly. Do you even want this anymore, Quentin? Alice asked. I mean, what we're doing here, this kings and queens idea? Of course I do. He'd almost forgotten why they were there. But it was true. A throne was exactly what he needed right now. Once they were ensconced in Castle Whitespire, wreathed in glory and every possible physical comfort, then maybe he could find the strength to come to grips with all this. You'd have to be an idiot not to. You know the funny thing, though? She sat up straight, suddenly animated. I mean, the really hilarious thing? You actually don't. You don't even want it. Even if this whole thing came off without a hitch, you wouldn't be happy. You gave up on Brooklyn and on break bills, and I fully expect you to give up on Fillory when the time comes. It makes things very simple for you, doesn't it? Well, and of course you were always going to give up on us. We had problems, but we could have fixed them. But that was too easy for you. It might actually have worked, and then where would you be? You would have been stuck with me forever. Problems? We had problems? People looked up. He dropped his face to a furious whisper. You fucked fucking Penny. I'd say that's a fucking problem. Alice ignored this. If he didn't know better, he would have said that he would have said that the tone of her voice almost resembled tenderness. Okay, gotta move. I will stop being a mouse, Quentin. I will take some chances, if you will. For just 1 second, look at your life and see how perfect it is. Stop looking for the next secret door that is going to lead you to your real life. Stop waiting. This is it. There's nothing else. It's here, and you better decide to enjoy it, or you're going to be miserable wherever you go for the rest of your life forever. You can't just decide to be happy. No, you can't. But you can sure as hell decide to be miserable. Is that what you want? Do you want to be the asshole who went to Fillory and was miserable there, even in Fillory? Because that's who you are right now. There was something true about what Alice was saying, but he couldn't grasp it. It was too complex or too simple, too something. He thought of that first week he'd spent at Breakbills when he and Elliot had gone scullying, and they'd watched the other rowers hunching and shivering in what to Quentin was a warm summer day. That was what he looked like to Alice. It was strange. He'd thought that doing magic was the hardest thing he would ever do, but the rest of it was so much harder. It turned out that magic was the easy part. Why did you come here, Alice? He said. If you don't even want this. She looked at him evenly. Why do you think, Quentin? I came because of you. I came here because I wanted to take care of you. Quentin looked around at the others. He saw Janet sitting with her back against one wall with her eyes closed, though Quentin didn't get the sense that she was asleep. The revolver was cradled in her lap. She wore a red t-shirt with a white star on it and khaki pants. She must be cold, he thought. As he watched, she sighed and licked her lips without opening her eyes, like a little girl. He didn't want to be cold. Alice was still watching him. Behind her, the mosaic was a swirl of green tentacles and white caps and floating fragments. He slid down the stone bench to her end and kissed her and bit her lower lip until she gasped. After a certain point, it was no longer possible to ignore the fact that they were lost. The hallways wound fiendishly and branched frequently. They were in a maze, and they were not solving it. Dent had become obsessive about his map, which now stretched to 6 sheets of graph paper that he shuffled and scribbled on intently whenever they turned a corner. At Breakbills, they'd learned a spell that would leave glowing footprints behind them, but Dent thought it would just lead predators straight to them. The walls were carved with ranks of crude marching figures in profile, thousands of them, each one holding a different totem, a palm leaf, a torch, a key, a sword, a pomegranate. It was darker here. They kept piling on light spells to anything that would take one. But the glow just didn't seem to go as far. They fast-walked down the corridor, double time now. The mood was that of a picnic threatened by lightning. The corridor branched and branched again, and intermittently dead-ended, forcing them to backtrack. Quentin's feet hurt in his brand-new hiking boots. A stray spur of something hard stabbed him in the same spot of his left ankle every time he took a step. He risked a glance back the way they'd come. There was a red glow back there. Something somewhere in the maze was throwing off a deep crimson light. He felt a deep-seated lack of interest in finding out what it was. 10 minutes later, they got hung up at a fork in the passageway. Dent vigorously supporting the right fork, Josh making the case admittedly largely on intangibles, that the other fork looked way more promising, and just feels more like what we want. The walls were painted with oddly convincing trompe-l'oeil landscapes now, crowded with tiny dancing figures. Doors slammed open and shut in the distance. The hallway was brightening behind them. They all saw it now. It was like a subterranean sun was rising. Discipline was getting ragged. They broke into a half-run, and it was too dark for Quentin to be absolutely sure that nobody lagged behind. He focused on Alice. She was panting. The back of her blouse gaped palely open, where the demon had torn its way out. He could see her black bra strap, which had somehow survived the operation. He wished he had a jacket to give her. He caught up with Dent. "We should slow down," Quentin panted. "We're going to lose somebody." Dent shook his head. "They're tracking us now. If we stop, they'll mob us." "What the fuck, man? Didn't you plan for this?" "This is the plan, Earthchild," Dent snarled back. "You don't like it? Go home. We need kings and queens in Fillory. Is that not a thing worth dying for?" Not really, Quentin thought. Asshole. That slutty nymph was right. This is not your war. They bullied through a door into a tapestry that was apparently concealing it from the other side. Behind the tapestry was a candle-lit banquet hall set with food, fresh and steaming. They were alone. It was as if the waiters who placed the dishes there had just moments earlier scampered out of sight. The table stretched out in both directions with no endpoints. The tapestries were rich and detailed, the silverware gleaming, the crystal goblets full of wine, deep gold and arterial purple. They stopped and stared in both directions, blinking. It was like they had stumbled into the dream of a starving man. "Nobody eats," Dent called. "Don't touch it. Nobody eats. Nobody drinks." "There are too many entrances," Anais said, her pretty green eyes flicking in all directions. "They can attack us." She was right. A door opened farther down the hall, admitting two large, rangy individuals of the monkey family, though Quentin couldn't have said exactly what to call them. Their glazed simian eyes looked bored. In perfect synchrony, they dipped their hands into pouches slung over their shoulders and came up with golf-sized lead balls. With a practiced wind-up of their overdeveloped shoulders and long arms, they whipped the balls at the group at big league fastball speeds. Quentin grabbed Alice's hand, and they cowered back behind a heavy tapestry, which caught one of the balls. The other one clipped a candlestick on the table and then spectacularly vaporized 4 wine glasses in a row. Under other circumstances, Quentin thought, that would actually have been cool. Elliot touched his forehead, where he'd been hit by a shard of glass. His fingers came away bloody. "Would somebody please kill those things, please?" Janet said disgustedly. She was crouched under the table. Seriously, Josh complained through clenched teeth. This shit isn't even mythological. We need some unicorns or something up in this piece. Janet, Elliot said, do your demon. I already did, she yelled back. I did it the night after graduation. I felt sorry for it. Huddling behind the rough fabric of the tapestry, Quentin watched a pair of legs stroll by unhurriedly. While the rest of them hunkered down, Penny strode confidently toward the two ball throwers as they wound up again. No expressions on their stiff monkey faces. He was gesturing fast with both hands and singing an incantation in a high, clear tenor. Calm and serious in the shifting candlelight, wearing just a t-shirt and jeans, he looked much less like a puffy wannabe than he used to. He looked like a hardened young battle mage. Was that how he'd looked to Alice? Quentin wondered, the night she slept with him. With one hand, Penny stopped a lead ball in midair, then a second. They hovered there, unsupported, for a moment like surprised hummingbirds, before they recovered their weight and dropped to the floor. With the other hand, Penny lobbed back a fiery seed that grew and expanded like an unfurling parachute. The tapestries on either side of the hall blazed where the fireball brushed them. It engulfed the two monkeys, and when it dissipated, they were simply gone, and a 10-foot section of the banquet table was a roaring bonfire. Yeah! Penny yelled, momentarily forgetting his fillery speak. Boom, bitches! Amateur, Dent muttered. If my hairline is messed up, Elliot said weakly, I will bring those things back to life and kill them all over again. They retreated along the banquet hall in the opposite direction, awkwardly shuffling past the straight-backed wooden chairs. The hall was just too narrow. With the table in the center, there wasn't enough room for them to form up properly. The setup had a zany Scooby-Doo feeling. Quentin took a running step and half-leaped, half-slid across the banquet table, clearing dishes as he went, feeling like an action hero sliding across the Firebird emblazoned hood of his muscle car. A curious Alice in Wonderland menagerie was crowding into the hall from either side. As military order broke down in the room, so did taxonomical order. Species and body parts were mashed up seemingly at random. Had everything collapsed after the Chatwins left, to the point where humans and animals interbred? There were ferrets and rabbits, giant mice and loping monkeys, and a vicious-looking fisher. But there were also men and women with the heads of animals, an astute-looking fox-headed man who appeared to be preparing a spell, a woman with a thick-necked lizard head with huge independent eyes, an oddly dignified pike-bearer upon whose shoulders swayed the sinuous neck and tiny head of a pink flamingo. Finn plucked a sharp knife off the banquet table, gripped the blade carefully between her thumb and forefinger, and threw it, spinning, so that it took the foxman point first in the eye socket. "Move!" she barked. "Everybody, fall back! Don't let them bog us down! We have to be close now!" They fell back along the length of the banquet hall. The basic idea was to try to keep a coherent line of scrimmage between them and their attackers, but the line kept getting disrupted. One of their party would get hung up, the chairs kept getting in the way, or the tomb dwellers would group together and make a charge, or worse, one of them would blunder in from the side through a hidden door straight into the center of their party. He and Alice managed to hold hands for the first 10 seconds, but after that, it just wasn't possible. This wasn't like the earlier fights. The whole thing kept degenerating into the running of the bulls. The hall seemed to go on forever. Possibly it did. The candles and mirrors and food gave the whole scene an incongruously festive air. Even if they decided to take the button home, at this point, It would be hard to muster everybody in one place to actually do it. Quentin jogged along with his knife out, though he didn't know if he was capable of using it. He felt like he had in gym class, trying to look like part of the team while at the same time desperately hoping nobody would pass him the ball. A giant house cat popped out from behind a tapestry right in front of him, and Finn almost certainly saved Quentin's life by cannoning fearlessly into the thing so that they rolled together on the floor, grappling and thrashing, until she knocked it out with a furious Ink Aga headbutt. Quentin gave her a hand up and they ran on. Need some water. Dent was putting on a show. He'd hopped spryly up onto the banquet table and was striding along it, rapping out percussive cymbals with astonishing speed and fluency, his wand tucked back behind his ear. His long black hair crackled and crazy energies flashed out from the tips of his long fingers. Sometimes he actually had 2 different spells going simultaneously, Quentin noticed. A primary attack in one hand and a second lesser piece of witchery simmering in his offhand. At one point, he made his arms swell up hugely, picked up 2 chairs in each giant hand, and clubbed down a half-dozen opponents with them in 3 businesslike swings, left, right, left. Penny managed to persuade a section of the table to rear up like an angry centipede and attack the Florians until they chopped it to pieces. Even Quentin got off a couple of sweaty-palmed magic missiles into the press. Finn's tunic was soaked with sweat. She closed her eyes and placed her palms together, whispering, and when she patted them, they gleamed with a terrible white phosphorescence. The next foe she met, a sinewy scimitar wielder, who was either wearing a leopard skin or was half leopard from the waist up. She shouted and punched her fist through its chest up to her shoulder. But the close calls were getting closer. The situation was disintegrating, and they needed an exit strategy. The corridor was filled with bodies and smoke. Quentin's breath whistled through his teeth, and in his head he was singing a psychotic nonsense song. Somewhere along the line, Quentin left his knife in a furry Florian stomach. He never saw the creature's face. It was a creature, not a person. Not a person, not a person. But later he would remember the sensation of jamming it in, how the blade punched through the tough rubbery muscles of the diaphragm, and then slid easily into the underlying viscera, and how the muscles gripped the blade after it was in. He snatched his hand away from the hilt like it was electrified. Quentin registered first Josh, then Elliot, hunched their shoulders and letting loose their cacodemons. Elliot's was particularly awesome looking, banded from head to foot in horizontal yellow and black danger stripes. It slid sideways across the smooth table, scrabbing like a flung cat, then charged into the fray with unself-conscious glee, clinging and tearing and leaping and clinging again. God damn it, Janet was screaming. What else? What the fuck else? This is bullshit, Elliot yelled hoarsely. Side door! Pick a side door and go through it. There was a moment of premonitory silence, as if some of the creatures actually sensed what was going to happen next. Then the door jolted, and a giant man made of glowing red-hot iron shouldered his way sideways through the wall. He took the whole wall down with him. A flying brick nicked Finn's head, and she dropped like she'd been shot. Waves of heat poured off the giant, warping the air around him, and anything he touched burned. He stood bent over, hands on the floor. He was about a third again, too tall for the confined space of the banquet hall. His eyes were molten gold. with no pupils. Dust filled the air. The giant put his foot on Finn's prostrate body, and she burst into flames. Everybody ran. Anybody who fell was trampled. The heat coming off the man's smooth red skin was unbearable. Quentin would have done anything to put distance between it and himself. There were pile-ups at the nearest exits. Quentin pushed past them and farther down the hall. He looked around for Alice and couldn't even find anybody human until he risked a look back and saw Josh standing in the middle of the hallway, all alone. He seemed to be undergoing one of his freakish power surges. He'd summoned another of his miniature black holes, the way he'd done that day on the welter's pitch. It had nearly swallowed a tree that day. Now, as Quentin watched an entire length of tapestry, wavered toward it, and it then flowed into it all at once, ripping free of its curtain rod with a sound like a fusillade of pistol shots. The light in the hall dimmed and became amber. The red giant was momentarily stalled by this. He was squatting down, studying the apparition, apparently fascinated by it. He was bald, and his expression was blank. His huge, hairless, glowing red cock and balls swung loose between his thighs, like the clapper of a bell. Then, Quentin was alone and running along a cool, dark side corridor. It was silent. The noise switched off like a TV. He was sprinting flat out. And then he was running, then jogging, and then, after a while, he was just walking. It was over. He couldn't run anymore. The air scorched his lungs. He bent over and put his hands on his knees. His back itched painfully, but behind his right shoulder, and when he reached back to scratch he found an arrow dangling from the hump of muscle there. Unthinkingly, he pulled it out, and a freshet of blood trickled down his back, but there wasn't much pain. It had only gone in an inch, probably not even that far. He was almost glad it hurt. The pain was something to hang on to. He held the wooden shaft, gratefully to have something solid in his hands. The silence was amazing. He was safe again. For a few minutes he allowed himself to luxuriate in the simple joys of breathing cool air, of not running, of being alone in the semi-darkness and not in immediate danger of dying. But the gravity of the situation kept seeping through, messily, until he could no longer blot it up. He could be the last one alive for all he knew. He had no idea how to get back up to the surface. He could die down here. He felt the weight of the dirt and rock over his head. He was buried alive. Even if he made it out, he didn't have the button. He had no way to get back to Earth. Footsteps in the darkness. Somebody was coming, walking. The figure's hands were glowing with a light charm. Wearily, and Quentin started in on yet another magic missile spell, but before he could finish, he realized it was just Elliot. He let his hands drop and sag to the floor. Neither of them spoke. They just leaned together against the wall, side by side. The cold stone soothed the little divot of pain the arrow had punched in Quentin's back. Elliot's shirt was untucked. His face was all smudged with soot on one side. He would have been furious if he'd known. "You all right?" Elliot nodded. "Finn's dead," Quentin said. Elliot took a deep breath and ran his glowing hands through his thick, wavy hair. "I know, I saw. I don't think there's anything we could have done," Elliot said. "Big Red back there was just out of our league, that's all." They fell silent. It was like the words had spun off into some void where they had no meaning. They'd lost any connection with the world, or maybe it was the world that had peeled away from the words. Elliot passed him a flask with something strong in it, and he drank and passed it back. It seemed to restore some link between him and his body. Quentin drew his knees up and hugged them. "I got hit by an arrow," he said. It felt like a stupid thing to say. In my back. We should go, Elliot said. Right. Backtrack. Try to meet back up with the others. Penny's got the button. It was amazing that Elliot could still be so practical after everything that had just happened. He was so much stronger than Quentin was. That big glowing guy, though. Yeah. Maybe he's still back there. Elliot shrugged. We have to get the button. Quentin was thirsty, but there was no water. He couldn't remember when he'd dropped his pack. I'll tell you something funny, Elliot said after a while. I think Anais hooked up with Dent. What? In spite of himself, Quentin smiled. He felt his dry lips crack. When did they even have time? Bathroom break, after that second fight. Wow. Tough break for Josh, but we have to applaud their initiative. Definitely. But hard cheese on Josh. Hard cheese. It was the kind of thing they used to say back at break bills. I'll tell you something else funny, Elliot went on. I don't regret coming here. Even now that it's all gone to shit, I'm still glad I came. Could that possibly be the stupidest thing I've ever said to you? But it's the truth. I think I was going to drink myself to death back on Earth. It was true. For Elliot, there hadn't been any other way. Somehow, that made it a little bit better. You could still drink yourself to death here. At this rate, I won't have the chance. Quentin stood up. His legs were stiff and achy. He did a deep knee bend. They started back the way they came. Quentin didn't feel any fear anymore. That part of it was over, except that he was worried about Alice. The adrenaline was gone too. Now he was just thirsty, and his feet hurt, and he was covered in scratches he couldn't remember having gotten. The blood on his back had dried, sticking his shirt to the arrow wound. It tugged uncomfortably every time he took a step. It became apparent pretty soon that he didn't have anything to worry about anyway, because they couldn't even find their way back to the banquet hall. They must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, maybe several. They stopped and tried some basic pathfinding magic, but Quentin's tongue felt thick and clumsy, and neither of them could seem to get the words quite right. And anyway, they really needed a dish of olive oil to make it work properly. Quentin couldn't think of anything to say. He waited while Elliot took a piss against the stone wall. It felt like they'd come to the end, but they had no choice but to keep walking. Maybe this is still part of the story, he thought numbly. The bad part right before everything comes out all right. He wondered what time it was on the surface. He felt like he'd been up all night. The masonry of the walls was older now, crumblier. For short stretches, it was just dusty, unworked cave rock. They were at the very outer fringes of its subterranean universe, wandering among badly eroded planets and dim, decaying stars. The hallway had ceased to branch now. It contented itself with curving gently to the left, and Quentin thought he could feel the curve getting gradually tighter, like it was spiraling inward, like the interior corridors of a nautilus shell. He figured it stood to reason, what little reason was left in the world, that there was a geometrical limit to how far it could keep curving in on itself before they came to something. Pretty soon, it turned out he was right. And that's it for today. Next week, we'll see you guys with Chapter 22.